Is Britain France? On the face of it, it's a pretty silly question. Britain is Britain and France is France. But we are facing similar political and economic crises. The French crisis has come into sharp focus this week, with Macron losing another prime minister. But both Macron and Starmer are the two most unpopular leaders, according to opinion polls, in the Western world. Both of them have lost the confidence of the people who put them in their high office, and in many ways the reason is the same. To quote Bill Clinton, it's the economy, stupid. That in neither country is the economy working, and neither of them is in a position to make the decisions necessary to help it work in future. What is going wrong? Well, the French debt is 114% of GDP, ours is just over 100%. Both are bad. Theirs is a little bit worse than ours. Both are running deficits. Our deficit is now in that doom loop where the deficit is greater than nominal GDP, and therefore our interest payments will be going ever upwards. And there is a link between the two, because to fund the British government, to sell the gilts, the government debt that is needed to make up the gap between income and expenditure, we need to pay a premium over the periphery of the Eurozone. Why? Because the Eurozone is seen to be backed by Germany ultimately, and therefore, though the periphery pays more than Germany, we are seen as being a bigger risk than that, because the currency could move and could fall as we find it harder to fund ourselves. So if French gilts, bonds, cost more, British bonds will cost more still. So we have a difficulty, a high cost in funding our deficit, and we have a high level of debt. The same is true in France. But both France and the UK have economic systems that are positively anti-growth, and in the UK, we're making it worse. France has some of the highest tax rates in the OECD, and we've been climbing up that particular ladder. France has some of the worst, most inflexible employment laws in the Western world, and with the Employment Rights Act, the Strikers Charter Act that is going through Parliament at the moment, the UK is following in that direction. But both countries also have politics that isn't working, is stuck. In France, it's because the president doesn't have a majority in the parliament. So the president can talk tough, he can say we've got to have these cuts, he's going to say cuts are really important, and then the parliament says no, we're not going to do this. And they're not going to back him because they are politically opposed to him, and the long-term solutions that France needs are inevitably painful in the short term. And why, if you're an opposition politician looking to a presidential election in 2 years, should you help a president who you don't support get things through? In the UK, the position is different, but not entirely dissimilar. Keir Starmer has a huge majority, has a majority of over 170 in the House of Commons, or did before he started losing a few people. He has a working majority of even more. If you read Philip Cowley's excellent new book, you'll see that because the Lib Dems and so on mainly vote with Labour and not with the rest of the opposition, Labour normally wins its divisions with majorities of over 200. But he can't get his business through because his popularity has declined and his backbench MPs see their seats at threat, and so they don't want to do the things that would bring things under control. What needs to be done? Well, we need to get a grip on expenditure. There is no more room for tax rises. Let me be absolutely clear about that. It's really interesting that if you go back over decades, the UK has almost never been willing to pay more than 38% of GDP in taxation. With our expenditure now well over 40%, the only way to get back into balance is to get expenditure under control. And where must the expenditure be controlled? Well, the two biggest areas are the NHS and welfare. In welfare, we have seen an absolute burgeoning of benefits being paid out to people for mental health reasons, particularly for stress and anxiety. we need to look through to see whether those are real and whether we're giving the right support to people who have genuine needs and whether there are other people who are making lifestyle choices about being on benefits. In terms of the NHS, we've just had the statistics on hospitals. Hospitals across the country perform very differently. They all get money. They all have extremely well-paid chief executives. The two bottom performing chief executives are both paid more than the Prime Minister. It's not about money, it's actually about systems. We have similar expenditure as GDP per capita as Australia and Switzerland, and we get worse outcomes. And I was very hopeful that Wes Streeting, who I think is a highly capable man, would be the Labour man who would reform the NHS. But again, this majority of 170 isn't allowing them to do things because they're unpopular and they daren't take a risk. So the welfare reforms got voted down, well, watered down because otherwise they'd have been voted down, and the NHS reforms aren't actually happening, they aren't taking place. So expenditure continues to rise. There's also room for efficiency within the civil service. And actually, to be fair to the government, they are trying this. They are implementing AI in government services, which is a good thing to be doing, but it isn't at the moment cutting any costs. And the number of civil servants continues to rise. Why does it continue to rise? Because Labour is, as always, in hock to the unions. It can't cut the numbers because the unions wouldn't like it, and they won't do anything about strikes because the Labour Party, the Labour movement, was born out of the trade unions. They are their founders, their incubators, their supporters. And so the tube strike that's brought London to a full stop has led chaos across the city's transport networks, carries on even though the law exists to allow them to stop it. The love of the unions means that the civil service cost won't be reduced, welfare cost isn't being reduced, and the health cost isn't being reduced. So in the budget that we now know will come in November, there is the likelihood of more taxation. But this won't work. And it won't work for two reasons. One is that you will see behavioural changes to make sure people don't have to pay the taxes. It's as simple as people won't work as long hours because they will see that they will lose more of their money in taxation. And there's nothing you can do about that. This isn't tax avoidance or tax evasion. It's just changing your life because you don't want to work for the government, you want to work for yourself. And we know that happens. We certainly know that it happens as people get to £100,000 a year because there is no point in them taking salary between 100 and 120,000. There is such a high marginal tax rate at that level that you might as well not bother and have the spare time, more free time to be with your family. So behavioural changes will mean that taxation as a percentage of GDP remains broadly static, may actually even fall, because people take more behavioural changes than are absolutely necessary, because they're disincentivized, their morale goes down, they feel peaked about what is going on. The other reason it won't work is this doom loop question, that if you can't finance yourself and you put on more taxes, the taxes take money out of the active economy. Bear in mind, everything the government spends has to be earned in the private sector, either today or tomorrow. There is no government money. There is no pot of money that the government has if the private sector doesn't provide it. But if you put taxes up, then the private sector loses money that it could spend on investing in new machinery and new equipment and new technologies. It loses money that it could give in pay rises to employees that could then boost the economy, boost retail sales, boost economic activity, boost car sales, all those things that make the economy grow. They become less likely because people don't have the money, because the government has got it. So you strangle economic growth, which you need to pay for what you're doing. So you get into this terrible doom loop because higher taxes weaken the economy, a weaker economy increases the deficit, a bigger deficit leads to more taxation leads to a weaker economy, and on it goes until you cut expenditure. And this actually has been what Labour governments have done again and again. They think they can spend money forever and raise taxes forever, and they discover they can't, and they have brutal cuts rather than well thought through ones. So the Labour government in the 1970s has the biggest cuts in the history of the NHS. Why? Because it had so mangled the economy that there was no other option. What happens in 1931, again, and this was perhaps more global than to blame entirely on Ramsay MacDonald, but Ramsay MacDonald has to cut unemployment benefit by 10%. Why? Because they've so mangled the economy. And this is what we are facing. We are facing a postponement of a day of reckoning that will come upon us because we are living beyond our means. And the way to live within our means is growth, and growth means lower taxes. But we can't have lower taxes until we've got lower expenditure, because the bond market, the gilt market, is not a charity. It is there to get a return. And I think about 2/3 of our gilts are foreign funded. That is, foreigners buying our debt to keep us going. They won't carry on doing this. Now, are we France? Well, we're very similar, because like France, we are postponing the day of reckoning. Unlike France, there is a government that ought to be able to do something, but lacks the backbone and has now become so unpopular that it may feel it hasn't got the mandate. But yes, we are facing a similar reckoning to France, and we have one hope that France does not have. And here, let's turn to history, because I hope many of you have read this wonderful book. It's volume 1 of 4 volumes by Jonathan Sumption on the 100 Years' War. Fascinatingly, the kings of France in the 14th century funded themselves by inflating the currency. They clipped the coinage, they reissued new coins, they basically had an inflation tax. We can still do that, and France in the euro can't. Inflation taxes aren't a good thing. They're very economically destabilizing. Part of the reason we were so successful in the early years of the 100 Years' War was that we were better financed than the French were. But the old French tradition of clipping the coinage, printing money in modern parlance, is not available to it in the euro, and it is available to us. Now, an inflation tax is bad economic policy. It is just possible. It is less painful economic policy than any of the other alternatives. It may well be what the Labour Party turns to, because it can do it by essentially sleight of hand, prestidigitation, rather than being straightforward with people, which tax rises and expenditure cuts reveal. People see them, they feel them, they notice them, whereas the inflation tax can be snuck in surreptitiously. So yes, we're like France. Yes, we're going the same way. There is a bit of an escape hatch for us, but it's not a pleasant one. It's not a good one. And it's the incompetence of this government that will make it necessary. What we actually need is a completely new economic policy, which slightly touches on the reshuffle. Oh my goodness, you have a reshuffle, and the one person who isn't moved is the one person who's doing the worst job of all. I might come back to that and another broadcast of this kind. Thank you all very much.